gratitude and highest heart love? Well, we've made it to Alaska. We are settled in now. It's time to continue with the reading of Poverty, Ethnic Identity, and Healthcare. I welcome you all that come and read these books. That's why I put them on here so you guys can all read with us. So, where we pick up at is chapter 3, page 37. Black Americans. And see, I wanted to take some time and peace, highest heart love. I wanted to take some time with this particular reading. So that's why I didn't want to rush it. So here we go. Page 37, chapter 3. Black Americans. The modern business and industrial complex has, since its beginnings in the 18th century, depended upon a supply of cheap labor to carry out the more burdensome and lower paying tasks. Traditionally, workers to perform these jobs have been recruited from the farm and the village. When rural areas were not able to meet the demands for workers, countries such as England turned to parts of their empire, particularly to Ireland. But in recent years, West Indians, Pakistani, and Indians have come to England in great numbers. Other countries, such as Germany and Switzerland, have since World War II recruited large numbers of Italians, Greeks, Yugoslavs, and people from other nations where industrialization has not been so advanced. Most of these workers sign to work for a stipulated length of time and leave their families behind. In a sense, they are today's counterpart to the sojourners and other temporary immigrants to the United States in the past. In the United States, industrial workers have traditionally come from the small towns and the farm, or from among the recent immigrants. Since World War I and the passage of the laws restricting immigration, the movement from the farm to the city has been sped up, both because of the demands for workers and because of the mechanization of the farm, which has tended to make the lot of the small farmer more and more difficult. Not all sections of the United States have undergone industrialization at the same pace, and in general, the greatest industrialization has taken place along the coastal areas and around the Great Lakes. This has meant the migration within the United States, at least in the 20th century, and has not only been from the farm to the city, but also from the South, one of the poorer and least industrialized sections of the country, to the north and west, and from the farm belt in the interior of the country to coastal and Great Lakes centers of industry. In general, those residents of the rural areas most likely to move to the city were either the young, the dissatisfied, or those who lacked property and investment. Inevitably, many of them went through periods of readjustment, which were as severe as those faced by immigrants from other countries. The so called Okies and Arkies, who migrated to California during the 20s and 30s, were met with hostility and exploitation. Their culture seemed to the Californians at the time to be almost an alien one. Peace, highest heart love, gratitude. Facing even greater prejudice in their migration northward were the Negroes, who were not only less educated than the Okies, but also had the difficulty of skin color and the burden of past slavery to overcome, replacing the Okies of the 30s as the most poverty stricken section of white America are the residents of the Appalachia, many of whom have moved to the city seeking employment as the coal fields and farms of Appalachia began to fail. Another source of cheap labor, both in the city and in the country, are the Spanish speaking migrants from Puerto Rico, who are American citizens, and those from Mexico, who cross the border both legally and illegally to find work. There are also large numbers of indigenous Spanish speaking peoples in the Southwest whose territory had been annexed to the United States in the 19th century, some of whom still lack real facility in English. Still, another indigenous group with real minority status are the Native Americans, the Indians, many of whom live in poverty on reservations or in the slums of the city. Other visible minorities, such as the Oriental Americans, also face problems, but economically, both the Japanese and Chinese Americans are better off than the Negroes, and the Spanish speaking Americans or the Indians. The Negroes, for the difficulties faced by various groups is in part explained by the examination of the way in which they have arrived at their present position. The remainder of this chapter will be devoted to discussing the Negroes. The Negroes. Blacks had come to America early, perhaps with Columbus, although there are some scholarly dispute as to whether Pedro Alonso Nino, the navigator of the Nina, was a Negro or not. It is known for certain that several members of the French and Spanish exploring parties were Negroes, and Jean Baptiste Point du Sable, the founder of Chicago, for example, was a Negro. Peace. The overwhelming majority of Africans who came to this country, however, were different from other immigrants in that they came unwillingly on slave ships. Slavery was big business in American colonial history, and many a New England fortune was built upon the transportation of slave ships. Slavery was big business. They transported slaves from the West Indies, where they had been brought by the British. During the 17th century, Dutch, French, Portuguese, and English companies were the mainstay of the slave trade from Africa. But by the 18th century, the English had achieved dominance. Slaves were captured or brought from Arab tradesmen in West Africa, primarily from the Gold Coast, modern Ghana, or the Congo. They were then chained together and packed into ships for the passage across the Atlantic. And although the mortality rate for European immigrants was high, that of black slaves was much higher. In fact, everything that the willing European immigrant had faced was compounded for the Negro, who faced greater overcrowding, less adequate food, and a general feeling of hopelessness. Probably no more than half of the slaves who were loaded on the ships in Africa actually reached their destination, at least in any condition which would enable them to become effective workers. Large numbers died of disease, committed suicide, or were permanently disabled, either by the ravages of disease or from the injuries they received. Profits were so great, however, that the traders made little effort to reform their brutal practices, but rather simply stuffed more people into the ships to compensate for their expected losses. Thank you for reading with us, guys. Thank you so much. We're in chapter 3, page 40 at the top. It was the development of the sugar crop in the Caribbean islands which had first made the American slave trade so profitable, and it was the West Indies which served as the destination of the early slave ships. Here, slaves were seasoned or taught their new work roles under the whips of overseers. It was, woof, it was from the West Indies that the slaves were transported to the American colonies, a trade which rapidly increased after 1792 with the invention of the cotton gin. Cotton became an important money crop in the South at a very time that sugar was becoming less important in the West Indies. To America's credit, there were always powerful critics of the slave trade, and they managed to abolish the practices in the United States as of January 1st, 1808. Great Britain abolished it first in 1806, but in stronger terms in 1811. Since the British controlled the seas as well as the west coast of Africa, their effort to abolish the trade proved particularly effective, and by the middle of the 19th century, it had been nearly eliminated. The elimination of the slave trade removed one abuse, but it did not necessarily improve the lot of the slave who now had to work harder. Moreover, some of the areas of the United States took to encouraging the breeding of slaves, selling the surplus to other areas. The abolition of the slave trade also did not end the practices of hiring contract laborers whom the British recruited in India, China, and elsewhere and transported to various ports. Contract laborers from China, for example, built the western portion of the transcontinental railroad across the United States, though nominally under contract. In fact, many of the indentured laborers were recruited by unscrupulous means, and all too often their contracts for return to their homeland was not honored. Thank you so much. Peace. Highest heart love, all love and honor. It was the British, nonetheless, who led the effort to eliminate actual slavery. In 1833, slavery was officially abolished in British possessions, although the act was only to take place after slaves had been trained to take jobs in society. In the British West Indies, for example, it was not until 1838 that all slaves were free. Gradually, other European states followed the British example, with France emancipating its slaves in 1848, Portugal in 1858, and Holland in 1863. Although in most cases freedom was given only gradually, Mexico abolished slavery in 1829 and Brazil in 1871. But the full effect was not felt in Brazil until around 1888. Slavery continued to exist in the Spanish possessions of Cuba and Puerto Rico, in the Caribbean, and in the Philippines in the Pacific until these colonies were taken over or given their independence by the United States as a result of the Spanish American War. In the United States, the struggle for emancipation was long and bitter and extremely divisive, mainly because slavery was not particularly profitable in New England, the middle Atlantic states, or the developing West, and thus it came to be a phenomenon largely concentrated in the South. Moreover, the fact that emancipation occurred only in conjunction with the Civil War undoubtedly made the life of the Negro freedman much more difficult than it might have been in, if the owners had been given compensation as they had in the British colonies. All this left its trauma on the American Negro. Scott, oh man, this is so good, right? Thank you so much. Oh, love, highest heart love. Impact of slavery. Scholars are not in full agreement about the impact of slavery on the culture of the American Negro, although the disagreement is probably more apparent than real. Frankly Fraser, Franklin Fraser, a pioneer Negro sociologist, held that the trauma of the terrifying trip across the Atlantic, the brutal breaking in experience in the West Indies or under the American plantation overseers, plus the humiliating experience of slavery itself, virtually destroyed the African cultural heritage. Peace, peace. And when they're talking about overseers, we mean slaveholders, slave drivers. Yeah, the brutality they try to take out with words. The surviving remnants were further weakened by the fact that slaves were forced to use English to communicate with each other because their tribal origins and languages varied so much, and individuals from the same tribe were usually separated from each other in order to cut down the dangers of insurrection. Slavery also destroyed the African family system since slaves were forbidden to marry. While free unions between men and women were undoubtedly formed, they could be violated by the owners of the slave, who could seize a woman for his own sexual pleasure or break up a potential family by selling off some of its members. Inevitably, the collective personality shaped by these experiences had little resemblance to the proud and independent African tribesmen who had been the slave's ancestor. Anthropologists, led by Melville Herskovitz, held that even though the experiences recounted by Fraser were true, the Negroes still managed to retain some of their past tradition. Herkovitz studied African culture traits and compared them with Negro culture traits in the New World and found similarities in language, religion, music, and numerous other aspects of culture. Though the slaves learned English, they used African patterns in speech and intonation and managed to keep alive folk tales and magical practices which they brought with them from Africa. Such carryovers, however, were more evident in the West Indies and in Latin America than in the large urban ghettos of the American North. Increasingly, as studies on Africa and the Negro have progressed, there has emerged a kind of consensus. Even though the slave was brutally removed from his past and thrust unwillingly into the radically different life pattern and denied opportunities to form associations to preserve fond memories, he still undoubtedly viewed his experience from the point of view of his past, and his culture was vibrant enough and ingrained enough to allow him to do so. In fact, the rich cultural heritage of the American Negro, however brutalized he might have been, has enriched all of American culture. The end of slavery. Emancipation of the slaves, however, did not end the problems of the Negro. Although slavery was abolished in the aftermath of the Civil War, few of the Negroes were educated, and many of them had picked up several traits in slavery which had made adjustments in a non slave society difficult. Moreover, the bulk of the white South was accustomed to Negroes as slaves, and they were determined to assert their dominance over the blacks, who in many parts of the South outnumbered the whites. When the Negroes, with the encouragement of the federal government and the presence of Union troops, assumed positions of authority, the South countered by establishing secret movements designed to keep the Negro down by terror if necessary. The Knights of the White Camellia and Ku Klux Klan were the most powerful of the secret orders, and armed with guns, swords, and other weapons. The members patrolled some parts of the South day and night. Scattered Union troops proved wholly ineffectual in coping with the problem, and the few Negroes were able to face up to the threats. Many either left the South or resigned themselves to trying to seek advancement through other ways. Those Negroes who did go north found that they were greeted with hostility and suspicion because most of the Northerners, while anti slavery, were also anti Negro. And see, that's the key right there that people don't want to talk about. They were also anti Negro or anti black. Though the dedicated abolitionists made attempts to ensure Negro rights in the South, they were comparatively few in number. Even though the Southerners had lost the war, they were determined to rule themselves, and they believed in their minds and hearts that the Negroes were not qualified to rule, as the restraints imposed upon the Southerners by the federal government and the presence of occupying troops were relaxed or removed, and then the stringent post war legislation repealed. The reconstruction of the South gradually fell into the hands of the Southerners. And while there were occasionally bloody racial clashes, the white Southerners soon emerged dominant. In the aftermath of the disputed presidential election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden, an agreement was made by the Republicans to withdraw all federal troops in return for Southern electoral support of Hayes. By this time, the North had grown weary of the crusade for Negro rights, and while there were still some old anti slavery leaders, most of the leaders of the younger generation had little zeal for the Negro and cared more about the industrial and business interests in the North and South. With the return of the old leaders in the South, most of whom identified with the Democratic Party, ways were soon found to disenfranchise Negroes or to nullify their political strength in spite of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. See? As soon as the political power of the Negroes and their allies declined, the South turned to erecting the barrier of segregation to replace the old barrier of slavery. I'm going to read that again. As soon as the political power of the Negroes and their allies declined, the South turned to erecting the barrier of segregation to replace the old barrier of slavery. This so called Jim Crow legislation separated blacks and whites on trains, in depots, on wharves, in barber shops, restaurants, theaters, schools, and in almost every aspect of life. This was not done without opposition, but the Southern officials either executed or expelled those Negroes who opposed the imposition of segregation. In the first 2 years of the 20th century, there were some 214 lynchings of Negroes in the South, and with the law, the courts, and the execution of justice in the hands of whites, Negroes, even though technically no longer slaves, had no had to struggle just to survive, and could only make feeble gropings in the direction of progress. Trends within the Negro community. It was in this situation that Booker T. Washington rose to prominence. Washington, who had become head of the Tuskegee Institute in 1881, believed that Southern whites in particular had to be convinced that the education of the Negro was in the true interest of the South. In a rather fatherly fashion, he counseled Negroes to respect the law, cooperate with the white authorities in maintaining peace, and to train themselves to become farmers, mechanics, and domestic servants until they had improved themselves sufficiently to be ready for better things. Washington taught habits of thrift, patience, perseverance, the cultivation of good manners, and in the process won the support of many Southern whites as well as Northerners who saw his plan as a formula for peace in the South. Though Washington believed in the ultimate attainment of acceptance and integration, many of his white supporters, skeptical of the capacity of the Negro to become completely assimilated, viewed his scheme as lending the Negro to his proper place in American life, a position which they felt should be inferior to that of the whites. Others of his white supporters were so happy with the gradual, gradualism that they never bothered about his ultimate goals. One of the leading opponents of the Washington philosophy was W.E.B. Du Bois, a Harvard educated, northern born Negro who went south to teach and to do research on the Negroes. Du Bois believed that it was impossible for Negroes, no matter what their level in society, to defend themselves without the vote. He also held that Washington's advice to the Negroes to stay in rural areas did not face up to the reality of the ongoing industrialization and urbanization in America. In 1905, a group of Negro men, under the leadership of Du Bois, determined to secure full citizenship, met in a conference at Niagara Falls in Canada. They wrote a platform which demanded freedom of speech and criticism, suffrage, abolition of all distinctions based on race, recognition of basic principles of human brotherhood, and respect for the working man. The group called itself the Niagara Movement and planned for periodic meetings. Following a race riot in Springfield, Illinois in August 1908, they joined the various old surviving abolition movements and other groups interested in bettering the lot of the Negro to hold a conference on Lincoln's birthday in 1909. Out of this came the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, most of whose first officers were white. The organization of the NAACP was followed in 1911 by the National Urban League, the NAACP, and to a lesser extent the Urban League, led the battle for more effective integration of the American Negro. Integration, however, was a slow and difficult process, and not all Negroes, however, was a slow and difficult process, and not all Negroes were agreed upon the aims of the NAACP. In fact, the NAACP failed for the most part to touch the imagination of the masses. Negroes on the lower social and economic level, if they knew of it or similar organizations, were inclined to regard them as agencies of upper class Negroes or of liberal whites who were not particularly aware of the economic necessities of remaining alive. Much more popular for a time was the Universal Negro Improvement Association, founded by Marcus Garvey. In 1914, Garvey exalted everything black and insisted that black stood for strength and beauty, not inferiority. He asserted that Africans had a noble past of which Negroes should be proud. He also held that the only hope for Negroes was to flee America and to return to Africa, where they could build a country of their own. His appeal struck a responsive chord, and his followers numbered in the millions for the time in the 1920s. Garvey's movement collapsed not because of Negro disillusionment with what he had advocated, but because of his own personal failures. He was accused of using the mails to defraud in raising money to run his steamship line to take Negroes to Africa. And in 1925, he was sent to jail under a 5-year sentence. When he was pardoned, he returned to his native Jamaica, and his movement was dead. The history of the American Negro in the 20th century, in part, has been a conflict between the dualism expressed by Du Bois and Garvey. One segment has pushed for integration, while the other has emphasized black power and ties with Africa. The Washington philosophy has little current following, and the most ignored of Washington's program has been his advice to stay on the farm, as is evident from the census figures. In 1910, 73% of the Negro population were rural and overwhelmingly Southern. By 1960, 73% were urban, and more Negroes lived outside of the South than in it. Although, in one sense, the Negroes are among the oldest immigrants, the change from the rural South to the urbanized, industrialized North has been so dramatic that, in effect, they have gone through a second immigration. It was in the period following the outbreak of World War I that large scale Negro migrations into the northern industrial cities really began to mushroom, a movement that is still underway. In the process, Negroes have come to have a politically potent voice in the North. And as they have become a politically force, gain access to better education and to some of the better paying jobs. Negro militancy has increased. Non-discriminatory provisions were required of defense industries in World War II. And this was followed by the passage of Fair Employment Practices Act in many states, and finally by the United States government itself. The NAACP and some of other civil rights and civil liberties groups had turned to the courts to redress some of the most outrageous forms of discrimination against Negroes. And in the period from World War II to today, whole series of laws have been declared unconstitutional, including restrictive covenants in housing, segregated interstate transportation, and separate but equal schools, declaring a law unconstitutional and achieving equality were, however, often different things. And beginning in the 1950s, a whole series of civil rights agitations led to the actual enforcement of some of the constitutional provisions giving equality. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1956 rose to fame and leadership through the role of Montgomery in the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. Sit-in demonstrations at lunch counters led to the integration of many Southern restaurants, and Congress itself, through various civil rights acts, attempted to remove the remaining barriers against discrimination. The result has been a period of turmoil and increasing militancy on behalf of the Negroes as they realized that much of the suffering they had endured in the past was no longer necessary. Inevitably, there have been riots as ghettos rebelled at the continuing forms of discrimination, and these riots, originally confined to Negro areas, have spread to areas of other minority groups, particularly the Spanish speaking Americans. Peace, guys. Thank you so much for reading with us. We are at the top of page 47. Thank you. Yes, poverty. Yes, thank you. Ethnic identity and healthcare. Thank you so much. I love y'all, man. All right. So we're going through this. You know what? I'm going to make this a two-part, okay? So, because it deserves that attention, right? So, all right. Here we go. We'll read this page 47. Inequalities in health and healthcare. One of the areas in which the past history of discrimination, repression, and suspicion has most effectively left its mark upon the Negro of today is in the area of healthcare. Data on life expectancy, which have been available since 1900s, indicate that there has been a persistent gap between the expected length of life of the white and the non-white population. 94% of those so classified are Negro. Table 1 shows these life expectancies by decade. Although the gap has narrowed as the health of the total population has improved, there are still significant differences. Table 1. Here you go. You can check out this table. All right. We're reading. Thank you so much for being here. Poverty, Ethnic Identity, and Healthcare by Vern Bullough and Bonnie Bullough. So this is the chart I'm just looking at. Life expectancy at birth for white and non-white population. Okay. So you saw those figures. It says there are still significant differences between the two groups. It is not only segregation and discrimination which have produced these differences in health, but also poverty, lack of education, and the negative psychological responses that follow from these difficulties. If it were necessary to rank these variables, poverty would undoubtedly come first. But in a sense, this is misleading because poverty is inextricably intertwined with all forms of discrimination, each difficulty reinforcing the other. Nevertheless, when one uses the index of poverty developed by the Social Security Administration, 35% of the nation's non white families fall below the poverty line, and there are almost an equal number who live in what is called near poverty. On the other hand, only 10% of the white population can be classified as falling below the poverty line, and about the same percentage belong in the near poverty group. Since the aged make up a large proportion of the poor white group, poverty among young families is more of a minority group phenomenon. This is important as assessing healthcare because neglect of the current health needs of the non white children can have long term consequences for their health, even if as adults they are fortunate enough to escape the cycle of poverty. Part of the explanation for the poverty of the non-white population is found in the lower educational level of the Negroes, but the problem is really more complex than it looks on the surface. Job discrimination has lessened since the passage of state and federal legislation outlawing such practices, but it still is an important factor in holding back the Negro worker. Moreover, the nature of the industry in the United States has changed during the last 2 or 3 decades so that there is less of a demand for the unskilled worker than in the past. As industry has become more and more mechanized, or as the cybernetic revolution has gathered momentum, jobs for unskilled workers have become more and more difficult to obtain. And we'll pause right here. All right. I just honor you all for reading with us. Here we go. By Vern and Bonnie Bullough, we have poverty, ethnic identity, and healthcare. All right, so we'll pause right there and we'll return with chapter 3, Black Americans. Thank you so much. Man, hi, it's Heart Love. I miss nobody. Oh, much honor. Look at this. Look how peaceful. Just laying right next to me while I read. Isn't that love? Kitty loves my reading too. All right. Hi, it's Heart Love. Much honor. I am now in Alaska, situated, and we will restart. Okay. I'll pick up with part 2 of Black Americans later on, and you'll see it soon. Okay. Hi, it's Heart Love. Thank you for all your donations. Oh, yes, yes, yes. That's right. Thank you for the donations. Through the Cash App, it was a Louis Zaire. Peace King. Thank you for reading the books with us. Thank you so much for your $150 donation. It's really helped a long way on the trip. So thank you guys so much for supporting readers. You know, we need more of this in the world, especially dealing with health care crisis. This is the book y'all chose. All right. Peace, peace. Hi, it's Heart, Love, and Honor. Thank you. Yes. Oh, yes, love. That is love. Thank you. I know. So cute, right? Peace, guys. All right. I'll see you soon.